Time to take up cigarette smoke.
The thought of someone, without warning or any assistance, literally catching on fire. Does it really happen?
We have many examples across the world of spontaneous human combustion where you and me one day just go on fire and just explode.
The spontaneous label implies something mysterious, something, out of the ordinary.
And it doesn't take very long.
Within a short time, 20 minutes or so, all that is left is their smouldering body and their extremities just spread out and just smoking, just ash.
Leaving the furnishings in their bedroom untouched.
So what causes this extraordinary phenomenon? Can it be explained by science, or is there another explanation? Reports of spontaneous combustion go back as far as the 18th century. One possible victim was a noble woman of Italian descent.
The Countess Bandi, which is one of the earliest cases I studied in the late 1700s.
The Countess was literally incinerated.
Her burnt remains were found in her room. There was nothing left. She was completely reduced just to a pile of ash, and ash all over the room. And it seemed to cause no damage to her room apart from a layer of soot across every surface.
By the mid-1800s, the phenomenon had become part of folklore and mystery.
Charles Dickens wrote his novel Bleak House, and he had a baddie in the novel, as of course you do, whom he rather unsubtly named Mr. Crook, and Mr. Crook died of spontaneous human combustion.
And his scientist friend Lewis was very angry at Mr. Dickens for misleading the public. And Dickens' view was, well, I'm just saying there are these cases, and they're real cases.
So even in Victorian England, the idea was so popular as to be not just a matter of scientific debate, but even turning up in scholarly fiction. Isn't that an extraordinary thought?
More recently in Ireland, neighbors spotted smoke coming from the home of Michael Faraday in 2010. They assumed the fire at the premises was accidental, and firefighters couldn't explain what they found.
Mr. Flaherty was in bed on his own, and his neighbour heard the smoke alarm and went to investigate what the problem was. She called the fire department, and they actually discovered his body to have been completely cremated, but the rest of his room to be completely untouched.
The coroner here in County Galway actually decided on a verdict of spontaneous human combustion, and as you can imagine, that caused a little bit of a stir.
Another infamous case dates back to 1951 in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Mary Reeser was missing for a while. Her landlady went to check to see how she was getting on, and she tried her door handle, which was extremely hot. The landlady notified police, and they found Reeser's remains completely turned to ash.
That case is known as the case of the Cinder Woman, and it's absolutely fascinating to look into. Her body was burned so thoroughly, more than a crematorium would have done, and the chair that she was in was consumed. Only the springs from the cushions were left. Her foot was left intact, and the rest of her was pretty much just a pile of burned, charred rubble with the chair. And yet, nearby objects were not damaged. This just freaked out people who saw it. How could her body be so intensely burned and yet nothing really be damaged except the immediate area?
Her skull had actually shrunk due to the heat that was generated by the fire, and it was remarked by the coroner and the investigators at the time. It was something they'd never seen before.
Police in the case searched for an explanation or any clues.
When last seen, Mrs. Reeser was smoking a cigarette. She was wearing flammable night clothes. She was sitting in a chair. Think of that as a large fuel source. She had taken 2 Seconal sleeping tablets and told her son, who was a doctor, that she planned to take 2 more because she was having trouble sleeping. So I think pretty much anybody would grasp the obvious that she dozed off, dropped her cigarette, and caught on fire. So far, so good. The problem is that that doesn't explain everything. Why was the fire so intense, apparently, immediately, but didn't burn her place down?
The case of Dr. John Irving Bentley may go some way to explaining the secrets of the phenomenon.
It's the person living alone that's usually the victim, and they're elderly or infirm. Well, Dr. Bentley was so elderly and infirm that he walked with a walker. He was in his 90s. And he had this unfortunate habit of dropping hot ashes from his pipe onto his clothing. And he would wake up, having dozed off, brushing out the fire, and the clothing in his closet was pockmarked with previous episodes. But this one time, of course, it got a little too far along. He woke up in a panic, hurried with his walker. We can infer this from various burn marks and things at the scene. He got into the bathroom with the intention of putting out the fire. Tried to get water out of the toilet with a pitcher to put out the fire. That only went so far, and he collapsed. There are pictures of Dr. Bentley's corpse, and mostly what's striking is you see the walker and you see his leg. And there's not anything of him seen, but there's a big hole burned in the floor. The linoleum, which is flammable, caught on fire, and it burned a hole through the floor. The flooring and subflooring caught on fire, aided by what's called the chimney effect, a draft from the cool air of the basement being drawn by the fire, drawn upward. And this made a very hot local fire.
Perhaps Dr. Bentley's death was self-inflicted, or perhaps not. And other theories exist which suggest certain consumptions fueled the so-called spontaneous fires.
One of the possible explanations that's often been put past is alcoholism, because quite a lot of the people who died were alcoholics, or at best heavy drinkers. And so the idea was, well, clearly they've got a lot of alcohol in their body, so they could become inflammable, and so perhaps that's how they caught fire.
Certainly if a person has been drinking alcohol, they would certainly more than likely pass out a lot more readily than they would if they had not consumed alcohol. But we do know that alcohol is flammable, so it is quite possible that somewhere within there is the perfect storm.
And one man was keen to disprove this hypothesis.
Many years ago in the Victorian era, a scientist called Justus von Liebig, he said, well, that cannot be true. He said, I did a very simple experiment. He said, I've got samples of animal tissue in little jars of 70% alcohol. So I soak them in pure alcohol, and they don't burn. So it's obvious that alcohol-soaked tissue doesn't burn. So alcohol cannot be the answer. And yet still, people insisted in saying that that was the cause.
Well, we now know that you could drink all you want until you die of alcohol poisoning, and it still won't make your body any more flammable.
Heavy drinking, careless pipe smoking, discarded cigarettes. All plausible, practical theories, but not enough to prove a spontaneous act of bursting into flames. So without scientific confirmation, is it something we simply can't explain? Is it really possible that a person can simply burst into flames with no apparent cause? Scientists have been studying the phenomenon for centuries, and as they've narrowed down the potential causes, many unusual theories have been suggested.
A more recent answer was what was called the wick effect. And the idea here is that a person catches fire to the blanket, which is covering them or their clothes, and the heat then from the burning melts the fat in their body like candle wax melts in a candle. And it would then soak into their clothes like candle wax would soak into a candle wick and catch fire.
The wick theory has been offered in the Reeser case.
In the case of Mary Reeser, there would have been an external source of ignition for the flame, and the natural oils and fat in the body was what ignited and consumed her body.
The body may have actually burned for 2 or 3 hours or several hours, burning very slowly. And in that case, the effect is of a big, tremendous fire. But in fact, there's only a little fire at any given moment, just a small fire working its merry way throughout the body. In all these cases, like Mary Reeser smoking a cigarette and so forth, there is usually some fiery material. And the Michael Flaherty case is one in which there was a fireplace and the burning was quite severe, suggesting the wick effect.
Like many suggested theories, the wick theory has come under intense scrutiny, including by the BBC, Britain's national broadcast company.
The BBC in the 1990s did an experiment. They got a pig's carcass, a fat pig, and they covered it with blankets. They poured a gallon of gasoline all over these blankets and set fire to it. And about 24 hours later, you had a very well-cooked pig carcass and an amazing aroma of barbecue at its best. But the pig was still intact. It hadn't burned away.
More recently, Professor Ford set out to see if these experiments could indeed reveal any truths about the phenomenon.
I got some fatty pork tissue and I treated it in alcohol, soaked it in alcohol for a few days, 5 days. And then we let it dry out and put it on a little aluminium cradle and set fire to it. Well, we couldn't set fire to it. I put a little gas burner on it and it crackled and it smelled quite like roast pork, but it wouldn't catch fire. So the next thing I did was the test of the wick theory. I wrapped it in a bit of gauze, like a little gauze pouch, and we set fire to the gauze pouch. And indeed, it burned for a moment or two, and then the part that was around the alcohol-infused fatty tissue just went out. The gauze carried on burning. So I'm afraid the wick effect doesn't explain it, and alcoholism doesn't explain it, and yet nobody had said what might explain it.
But a new theory from the professor may have the answer as to what causes spontaneous human combustion.
I work with living cells, and the body is a bag of living cells. And in human metabolism, cells sometimes produce an unusual chemical in large amounts, and that's acetone, nail varnish remover. It's an inflammable liquid. And if a person is ill, or if they're an alcoholic, say, they often produce acetone as a byproduct of their cell's normal metabolism. And acetone builds up in the body. Now, I thought to myself, well, a lot of alcoholics have died of spontaneous human combustion. But they weren't all alcoholics. Some of them never drank any alcohol at all, so they can't be the answer. But there were alcoholics. And when I looked into the cases, I realized that all the people were unwell. They were ill in some way. And when you get ill, that's when the body is likely to produce acetone. That's a condition we call ketosis. Some people actually take a ketosis diet in order to put the body into a state of ketosis to help to burn fat. Little children, if you nurse a teething baby, and you may catch the smell of acetone on its breath, because when it's teething, it's not very well. If you see a diabetic in a hospital bed, a person who's quite ill, and you will often get the scent of acetone. If you go and kiss your grandma, who might be in an old people's residential home, and as you lean over, you might get the scent of acetone. People, when they're not very well, do produce acetone. It's not that rare. I then took bits of fatty pork tissue and we experimentally marinated those in acetone. We constructed 1/12 scale model people and we dressed them in miniature clothing. And I sat them on a miniature wooden chair. And I put a backdrop of a room. And then I lit my little gas burner, the one that I'd tried to set fire to the alcohol-soaked tissue, which failed. And as I brought it near, because of the trace of acetone vapor in the air, it went woof, up like a rocket. And within a minute or two, the skull had burned away, the eyes were burning away, the tissue was burning away, the arms began to erupt into flame, the whole of the torso was bursting into flame. And with great drama, you might think, the model fell over, collapsed onto the floor, just as full-sized people do when they have been victims of it. So great was the heat coming out of the melted fat from this burning victim that the ceramic plate burst with an explosive bang that made us all jump. And over the next few minutes, the pool of liquefied fat that had all boiled out and diffused out of the body was burning away with little flickery flames, and a few minutes later the flames went out. And there we were left with the ashen body and the extremities, the arms and the legs still relatively unburned, and it was exactly like the photographs that you see of a victim of real life spontaneous human combustion. And so we had demonstrated for the first time an experimental model of how human spontaneous combustion just might work.
Professor Ford acknowledges one flaw, however.
My experiment fails in one important respect, and that is the amount of acetone in our little model body was much greater than you'd have in a normal human body. The body isn't marinated in acetone. I think what happens is that the acetone collects in the fat, and that the fat and the acetone together build up to form a sort of an inflammable, almost a semi-explosive compound that can burn. And that's what our experiments tend to show. You might then say, shouldn't everybody who's got, say, diabetes and who is ketotic, shouldn't these people be terribly worried that they're going to burst in a flame? No, of course not. And I say that because it's a vanishingly rare occurrence. There have only ever been a few hundred cases in the whole history of mankind, as far as we know. So it's not a thing anybody need worry about. On the other hand, if you are a diabetic, or if you are in a state of ketosis, now would not be a good time to take up cigarette smoking.
Spontaneous human combustion is rare, and the skeptics refuse to accept that a person's body can incinerate totally in such a short time. So what are the real reasons behind this extraordinary phenomenon? Can it really happen?
A lot of people have refused to accept that spontaneous human combustion could exist.
The human body is mostly water, and there just are no chemical combinations, kind of real or imagined, that have ever shown the slightest possibility to combust. It's just totally a myth. One of my favorite cases is that of Dr. J. Irving Bentley. It's a case where we know what the ignition was. Just as we do in nearly every case, we either know what the ignition was, or we can reasonably infer that a spark from a fireplace or something, in Bentley's case, hot ashes from his pipe, for sure.
You can see why people just won't believe it's real. It just doesn't seem possible. We all know that if you put a piece of beef into the oven and you cook it for hours and hours and it's still there, it's now cooked, how can a person be reduced to a pile of ash in a matter of minutes? It just doesn't seem possible. So the easy answer when you're presented with a conundrum like that is to say, oh, well, it just doesn't happen. I just don't believe it. But in fact, there have been so many reports from eminent policemen, from distinguished pathologists, from scientists who've been there and inspected the remains. And they have written the cases up and published them. And it's quite clear it's real. You can't just get away with saying, no, it doesn't happen, because the science shows that it does.
So with all the evidence, is spontaneous human combustion a genuine possibility, a simple case of self-arson, or something science can't explain?
Spontaneous human combustion can't really exist. There's just no mechanism, no chemical mechanism that any reasonable person can come up with. And as far as science knows, it has never happened. So it's really in the realm of the very, very, very unlikely, probably the impossible. No example of it.
The verdict really should be unexplained death. Therefore, investigators can repeat going back, and having stored some of the material from the scene, they can carry on performing tests to ascertain exactly what it was that caused this combustion.
I don't think I would encourage any young postgraduate to pursue this area in the expectation of making their name in science. It is almost certainly a mythical concept.
All I set out to do was to show that there was one mechanism using a substance produced in the body naturally that could make the body inflammable. And that we've succeeded in doing. I've shown that there is a possible mechanism. What I'd like now, of course, is for others to take it up and do it more methodically and to work out whether it actually works that way in humans. But until we get a better explanation, mine is the first that works.
Bizarre flames spring up without warning, consume their victims, and ignite a firestorm of controversy. George Mott, engulfed in an inferno, while just feet away, his television barely melts. Mary Hardy Reeser, turned to cinder except for her foot. Helen Conway, consumed and reduced to ashes in just 21 minutes. And Beatrice Oski, burned to death while nothing nearby, including her cotton socks, catches fire. Are they victims of spontaneous human combustion? Or is there a scientific explanation for what killed them? These aren't isolated cases. Hundreds of incidents have been recorded all the way back to the 1700s. In the 1800s, social reformers blamed a much maligned malady, demon rum. They saw a connection between alcohol and these fires.
The idea was that maybe their body tissues just became so saturated with alcohol that their flammability was heightened. And you can see how in the middle of the 19th century that could have seemed almost to make scientific sense. It's utter scientific nonsense, actually.
If it's not alcohol, is there another chemical chain reaction that could trigger the fires? Larry Arnold points out that skeptics and scientists are unwilling to consider what seems obvious to him: spontaneous human combustion.
Mainstream science has no problem with spontaneous combustion, but when you inject human between spontaneous and combustion, you unleash a firestorm of derision, denial, and ridicule.
For spontaneous combustion to occur in humans, it would have to start inside the body and radiate outward. Arnold has an unorthodox theory on how this happens. He believes a still-to-be-discovered subatomic particle he calls a pyrotron strikes another subatomic particle inside the body. The collision triggers what amounts to a runaway nuclear explosion. Once this reaction takes off, it blazes out of control and burns the body from the inside out.
It's a theory. We can't prove it, but it's worthy of consideration in this larger mystery that history presents to us as spontaneous human combustion.
This is not something known to science, so you could call it X-force or X-factor. It's a pseudo-explanation. It doesn't explain anything.
The chemistry of human fat is not supportive of the kind of chemical reactions that have to go on for self-heating to occur. So the theory that this is a chemical reaction within the body producing an unusual amount of heat just doesn't work.
DeHaan believes in a much more established theory based on scientific principles.
Well, even good fire investigators, will look at a fire and go, "Oh, this is really strange." Well, yeah, it might be strange, but there's always an explanation, a scientific explanation.
DeHaan believes that cases of spontaneous human combustion are really caused by what he calls the wick effect. In the wick effect, a thick layer of fat under our skin provides the fuel. Once a fire heats it up, fat starts to liquefy. After the skin splits open, the fat is drawn from the body by clothes or other flammable material.
What happens is that as the fire chars the surrounding material, that charred material acts as a wick, and the body fat renders down, is absorbed into that wick material, and that's what actually supports the combustion of the body.
When heated, subcutaneous fat burns almost as well as diesel fuel or candle tallow.
I can get a lot of heat out of every gram of subcutaneous body fat.
So you're getting not a quick burn over like in a lot of cases of fire. but you're getting the body's almost feeding on itself.
Frank Baker is a decorated Vietnam War veteran. He has 2 Purple Hearts and a Gallantry Medal. But his closest brush with death was not on any battlefield. It was right here in Vermont. This is the first time he's spoken about the horrific events of June 1995.
We were getting ready for fishing. We were sitting on the couch the day before the Derby. Everything was great. Pete was sitting next to me. We were having one hell of a time, and all of a sudden,
it was the damnedest thing I've ever seen. Frank was freaking out and making me freak out.
I was in sheer panic. All I could do was try to fight it. I was petrified. I had no idea what was taking place with my body. None.
Eventually, Pete and Frank managed to extinguish the flames and get Frank to a doctor. For Frank, this was only the beginning, and the medical profession were no help.
The doctor was completely baffled, and he said, looking at it, Frank, this burned from the inside out. And he said, I've never, ever seen anything like this.
Yet Frank was nowhere near any source of heat or flame.
I wasn't smoking, there were no flames around, there was no lights on, no microwaves. All that was coming in was the sun from the far end of the house when this happened.
Frank Baker appears to fit all the criteria for survival of partial spontaneous human combustion, and he's had to deal with it. He's had to come to terms with something that was said to be impossible, something that could not happen.
They say it can happen any day, at any time, without a moment's warning. Innocent men, women, or children minding their manners when out of nowhere they spontaneously combust into a ball of fire, ash, and horror. But could this frightening phenomena actually be real, or is it nothing more than a burning urban legend? Let's find out in today's episode of
Colossal Mysteries.
The very first reports of spontaneous human combustion date back to a 1641 book by a Danish doctor. He cataloged strange medical phenomena and wrote about the death of an Italian knight who, according to the doctor, drank a few glasses of wine at home, burped fire, and eventually burned to death in the flames. But it wasn't until the 1850s that spontaneous human combustion became a popular unexplained phenomenon, thanks to a novel by Charles Dickens called Bleak House, where a character dies by spontaneous combustion. Critics tore into Dickens for legitimizing an urban legend that they believed didn't exist, but he responded by producing 30 historical cases of potential spontaneous human combustion. Even today, there are examples of unexplained death that some believe might be evidence of spontaneous combustion. Take Maybelle Andrews, for example. Poor Miss Andrews was partying with her friends and fiancé when a blue flame burst from her completely out of nowhere while she stood at the top of the stairs. Or how about 61-year-old Jeannie Sappin, who died in 1982 at her kitchen table when, according to eyewitnesses, a blue flame erupted from her stomach, burning her, but leaving the kitchen unscathed. There's even an official case of spontaneous human combustion on the books in Ireland. A 76-year-old man named Michael Fahartley was found with severe burns near an open fireplace. The coroner, tasked with confirming the cause of death, made the scandalous decision to mark his death down as spontaneous combustion, convinced the fireplace wasn't involved and unsure of any other possible causes. But most scientists remain skeptical of spontaneous human combustion. They argue that in virtually all these cases, there must be a missing source of the flame, such as cigarette, candle, or match. But even the most skeptical scientists remain stumped by the true cause of these deadly detonations. and plenty of possible explanations have been put forward. Almost all victims were in poor to extremely poor health, all with limited mobility. Some experts believe they most likely caught fire and simply couldn't move. Another potential hypothesis was put forth by British biologist Brian Ford in 2012. He believes that these unusual cases can all be chalked up to a flammable liquid produced inside the body called acetone. According to Ford, a particular type of putrid and unhealthy diet can cause a buildup of acetone, which catches fire, causing death by blazing hot internal inferno. Horrifying? Sure, but not exactly spontaneous combustion. So spontaneous human combustion lies somewhere in the unknown, nestled between non-existent and very, very unlikely. But until we can solve these curious, unexplained cases, we can't say for sure that it doesn't exist. And that's the explosive truth. And now you know a little bit more about the mystery of spontaneous human combustion. Comment below with a mystery you'd like us to solve. And remember to subscribe for more episodes of
Colossal Mysteries.
Only on DreamWorks TV.
This is a mystery even Sherlock Holmes wouldn't be able to solve. Imagine coming home one day to your partner. You put the key in the door and say something along the lines of, "Hey honey, I'm home." There's no reply. You go to the kitchen and she's not there. So you enter the living room only to be met by the most gruesome thing you've ever seen or will see. Your nearest and dearest is a pile of smoldering ashes on the floor. Well, there's a foot, still wearing the Nike shoes that she just bought. Besides the immediate area under her, the rest of the room is fine. It's as if she just went up in flames, combusted all by herself. You, as well as the investigators that later arrive, have no idea how this happened. A week later, the newspapers state, "Cause of death unknown." That might sound like something from a tale of the Twilight Zone, but it has happened before, many times in fact. The term for it is spontaneous human combustion, which just means someone seemingly going up in flames, possibly without external factors being to blame. You've likely seen such a thing in horror movies, but it's not something we expect to see in real life. First, we'll present to you a case of this happening, and then we'll try and find out why it happens. The year is 1951, and it was a steamy, hot summertime in Florida, USA. The landlady of a woman named Mary Hardy Reeser had a telegram for her renter, and so she went around to the house. Only she put her hand on the doorknob and it felt kinda hot. That worried her, and so she called the cops. The police opened the door and had the shock of their lives, because when they entered the living room, what they witnessed was pretty much a bunch of smoldering ashes in a burnt-out chair. The only part of the woman not incinerated was the bottom part of her leg. One black shoe was still on her foot. We've seen the photo, and you can only imagine how this perplexed the cops. No one had broken into the house, and the fire had completely destroyed the woman from what seemed like within. It was like she had just gone up in flames and not even moved from the chair. In that chair lay some backbone and a shrunken skull, along with other bits of bone fragments. The news reports actually said her skull was shrunk to the size of a cup. Police, the fire department, and pathologists were baffled. Had she caught fire, she would have moved or called for help. How could a body just burn like that? It seemed to some people as if she had burned from the inside and that she must have gone up in a very intense blaze. It would have taken extremely high temperatures to cremate a person on the spot. The US media was in a frenzy about this, with one outlet calling it the case of the Cinder Woman mystery. And a mystery it was. Perhaps, the media said, the loving mother had been somehow hit by a freak lightning strike. Someone wrote into one newspaper saying, "A ball of fire came through the open window and it hit her. I've seen it happen." No one was sure though, although some outlets started to peddle the theory of internal human combustion. It wasn't a new thing. There were reported cases of it happening for centuries. The investigation found no traces of accelerants such as gasoline or other combustible fluids. It really seemed like she had gone up in flames. One of the investigators said it was the most unusual case I'd seen during my almost 25 years of police work. That same investigator then turned to anyone who might have knowledge of this, issuing a note that read, "We request any information or theories that could explain how a human body could be so destroyed and the fire confined to such a small area, and so little damage done to the structure of the building and the furniture in the room, not even scorched or damaged by smoke." And so came back a theory, although one that a lot of people didn't really accept. The theory was called the wick effect. To explain this, you need to know some things about our dearly departed Mary. 1. She took sleeping pills, and 2. She was said to be a very enthusiastic smoker of cigarettes. She was also on the larger side, and let's just say she was flabby. Hey, she was 67 and lived alone. She liked to eat. So the theory goes that she might have taken some of those pills and then fallen into a deep sleep. As she hardly ever had a cigarette out of her hand, her daughter would later confirm this, she might have fallen asleep with that smoke still going. She was wearing a nightgown made of rayon acetate, which could have easily gone up in flames. So, said the theorists, her smoke caused the gown to catch fire, and then, as she couldn't wake up, she slowly burned until she melted much like a candle left to burn. Beside the chair, there was nowhere for the fire to go, so it just consumed her, as she had so much fat on her that could have helped the smoldering process as fat burns. Does that explain things for you? Likely not, and it didn't impress a lot of scientists either. One skeptical scientist said the obvious thing, in that for such a cremation to happen, she would have had to burn at several thousand degrees for several hours. He added, "I cannot conceive of such a complete cremation without more burning in the apartment." He also asked about a shrunken skull. In a normal fire, it would have exploded. He wrote, "In presence of heat sufficient to destroy soft tissues, the skull would literally explode into many pieces. I've never known any exception to this rule." That, along with the case in general, has remained a mystery. If you were indeed Sherlock Holmes, you might come up with another theory which is perhaps darker but less mysterious. Maybe she was killed by a murderer who had some kind of crematorium device. He then decided to not finish the foot, bring back the body to his house, then burn the chair to make it look like the event had happened in the room. Oh, and of course, not a person saw this. Yep, that doesn't sound too plausible either. Like we said, this case, it seems, is immutably unsolved. As you'll see, there are many such unsolved cases like this one. You won't be surprised to hear that a lot of people think something out of this world made it happen. It does sound like the work of a demon, and hey, if you've seen the horror movie Hereditary, you'll know that demons allegedly get up to such things. You might call this an outlier in terms of theories. It seems that from the first reported case in the 18th century to the present date, there have been 200 cases that looked like internal human combustion. Most experts have no explanation for this in the scientific sense, so they say it doesn't exist, meaning that there has to be external factors at work. At the same time, people have seemingly burned from within, and there has been no easy explanation. People haven't stopped trying to explain though, and for quite some time. Back in the 19th century, some scientists thought it might have had something to do with alcoholism, but they didn't say exactly how booze could create the mortal bonfire. It just seemed that a lot of these incinerated folks were partial to a drink, or 10. It was a recurring theme, at least. In the British Medical Journal in 1938, one man wrote that alcoholism seemed to be a factor in most cases. He also said that when it occurred, it usually happened to older women. In more recent investigations, it was written that in most cases, the people were, like Mary, likely close to a fire source, whether that was a cigarette or a lamp or a candle or an open flame. To add to that, booze, or in Mary's case, the sleeping pills. They catch fire but are too zonked or drunk to wake up, and then it's possible the material around them caused a bigger fire. In turn, their body fat seeped into the material and caused the fire to burn at a higher temperature. And that, say some people, is how they melt on the spot. The only things spared are the extremities, such as that shoe. We've seen a few pictures where almost entire legs survived, but nothing else. The photos show just ash and legs. There are also more recent cases. There's this story reported by the Independent newspaper in the UK in 2017. Here's the first line of the story. A pensioner has died of his injuries after bursting into flames in unexplained circumstances in a London street. We looked into this, and while weird to say the least, it seems investigators think he somehow managed to set himself on fire. Okay, that's plausible, we guess. But what about Michael Faraday, a man who died not long ago in Ireland aged 76, whose death was called by the pathologist a result of internal human combustion? Police said no foul play and no accelerants were to blame. He had burned to ashes, just like Mary. The medical examiner concluded this fire was thoroughly investigated, and I'm left with the conclusion that this fits into the category of spontaneous human combustion, for which there's no adequate explanation. Skeptics in this case, as in others, said the same thing, that there must have been an ignition and a sleeping person and then an almighty conflagration. They also asked the same question as they've asked for years, which is, why does internal human combustion not happen more often if it exists? And we found more cases, but we won't describe them all as they all sound alike. That is, they involved an elderly person burned to ashes with some extremities left. In some cases, there was a possibility of a flame being nearby, but it's unlikely in a few cases that this was to blame. The cause of death was often stated as unknown, We should say that we found one case of this happening to someone who was just 42. People dying like this confounds us all, and even the medical experts aren't ready to place their bets on one possibility alone. It really is a mystery in most cases, and it's been going on for a while. You'll find the novelists Charles Dickens and Herman Melville all the way back talking about this mystery. And while many people will invoke the paranormal, the closest thing science has come up with is the wick effect. There is one recent alternative theory, though, and this was posited by a British biologist named Brian J. Ford. In 2012, he tried to answer the question in The New Scientist of why humans spontaneously combust. He doesn't believe in the wick effect or anything close to the paranormal. He doesn't buy any of the theories put forward so far. He believes that the phenomenon could be down to diet and something called acetones being produced by the body. This might happen as a result of a certain diet, diabetes, and/or boozing. This is what he wrote about these things in a long paper on the subject of going up in flames. Acetone is familiar as nail polish remover, and it may seem to be an unusual compound to find in metabolic cycles, but it is always present in the body in small amounts, and it can be used as an energy source by living cells. It is highly flammable, he said, and is present on the breath. He added that it also collects in layers of fat and on clothes. He said even static electricity produced by combing your hair or removing certain clothes might ignite the stuff, not to mention lighting a cigarette. And voila, the conflagration commences. He actually put this to the test in a lab and concluded, for the very first time, we have plausible models for spontaneous human combustion, which offers a natural metabolic explanation for this well-documented phenomenon. Are you convinced by any of these theories, or do you have your own? Tell us in the comments. Now go watch our episode on the weirdest brain disorders. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.
Spontaneous human combustion occurs when a person bursts into flames due to a chemical reaction inside the body, without an external source of ignition. One fact that many of these cases have in common is that the fire never seems to spread. It occurs in one particular place, and once the victim is reduced to ashes, the fire mysteriously disappears. So here are 5 mysterious cases of spontaneous human combustion. Michael Faraday was a 76-year-old man who was found burned to death in the living room of his home at Clairview Park, Ballabane. In the early hours of December the 22nd, 2010, Faraday's neighbour Mr. Mannion was awakened by the sound of a smoke alarm. Mannion went outside to find heavy smoke coming from Faraday's house. Getting no answer from knocking on the door, he roused local residents, then shortly after called the Gardaí and fire brigade. Faraday's home was searched by forensic experts from the Gardaí and the fire service. His body had been found lying on its back with his head closest to an open fireplace. The fire had been entirely confined to the sitting room, and the only damage found was to the totally burnt body, the ceiling above and the floor beneath him. No trace of any accelerants were found, and there was nothing to suggest foul play had taken place. Assistant Chief Fire Officer Jerry O'Malley told the inquest into the death that after a thorough investigation, fire officers were satisfied that the open fire was not the cause of the blaze which led to Faraday's death. A post-mortem carried out by pathologist Grace Callaghy noted that Faraday had suffered from type 2 diabetes and hypertension, but had not died from heart failure. Callaghy concluded that the extensive nature of the burn sustained pre-clues determining the precise cause of death. In September 2011, the West Galway coroner Dr. Kieran McGlowin informed the inquiry into the death that he searched medical literature to determine the cause of death. The coroner referred to Professor Bernard Knight's book on forensic pathology, which states that a high number of alleged incidents of spontaneous human combustion had taken place near an open fireplace or chimney. The coroner subsequently made a statement to the inquiry. This fire was thoroughly investigated, and I'm left with the conclusion that this fits into the category of spontaneous human combustion, for which there is no adequate explanation. George Mott was a retired fireman that suffered from lung problems and required an air mask and pump to breathe. In March 1986, his son Kendall went to go and see him and found all the windows browned and the interior smoked. His father's remains consisted of ash, a few splinters of bone and a fragment of skull. The very localised damage suggested that George had died from spontaneous combustion, a situation that is yet to be explained. George was a known drinker and used an oxygen tank, but it was not in use at the time of his death. A pack of matches were found next to the tank, but had never ignited. Young Sip Kim lived in Hawaii his whole life. He spent most of it paralysed from the waist down and made his way around in his wheelchair. In December 1956, he was at home when, without warning, flames began to emanate from his stomach, rapidly spreading in all directions and engulfing him within seconds. A neighbour of his quickly ran to his aid and later said that he was covered in blue flames. She called for assistance from the fire department, but by the time they had arrived some 15 minutes later, both the man and his wheelchair were nothing more than a pile of ash. All that remained of him was a pair of feet. No other areas of the room suffered any damage, and once the flames had succeeded in reducing the paralysed man to nothing more than ash, they seemed to have simply disappeared instead of spreading elsewhere. Firemen and investigators were perplexed by this, as there were clothes and books all around that should have caught fire given their proximity to the fire. In 2013, when Danny Van Zant's incarcerated body was discovered by members of his family, it was instantly apparent that although the heat and power of the blaze must have been great, there was no other damage to the rest of the wooden house where the 65-year-old lived in Oklahoma. Van Zant's brother discovered the victim in the kitchen and immediately called 911. Fire crews found a badly burned body but no fire damage to nearby furniture or other items. There were no signs of a break-in or struggle or any cause of death. Although many people pointed out that Van Zant was a well-known alcoholic and very heavy cigarette smoker, the physical evidence at the property suggested that neither were the cause. Not only was no other part of the home damaged, but there were no signs that a struggle had taken place which might have suggested foul play. Investigator Ron Lockhart, as if to make a point even clearer, stated, "You could pour gasoline on somebody and he wouldn't be as badly incinerated." Although Lockhart said that he believed that there must have been some ignition source, the suggestion of spontaneous human combustion was not officially ruled out. Sheriff Lockhart said it's very unusual and it's bizarre and I can't explain it. It's well known that a tremendous amount of wood was required to reduce a human frame to mere ashes. On average, 2 cartloads of wood were required to burn a criminal at the stake, and the same amount was needed to cremate a corpse. So the fact that people are being found burned down to ashes, including their bones, on relatively undamaged floors, with no other obvious signs of fire damage within the area and often with undamaged limbs left behind, all implied a form of burning that had to be quite different from the fires used for cremation, a form of burning that might be supernatural. Mary Hardy Reeser of St. Petersburg, Florida was a believed victim of spontaneous human combustion. The last time Mary had been seen alive was at 9 p.m. on the night of the fire. Her son, Dr. Richard Reeser, and her landlady, Mrs. Carpenter, had visited Mary and said their farewells at around 9 p.m, leaving Mary sitting comfortably in her chair. On July 2, 1951, at around 8 a.m, Reese's landlady, Mrs. Carpenter, arrived at Reese's door with a telegram. Trying the door, she found the metal doorknob to be uncomfortably warm to touch, and called the police. Upon entering Mary's apartment, a grisly sight confronted them. The freakish remains of Mary were discovered on a burned-out chair with only the charred coiled springs remaining. The only parts of her left were her left foot, which still had a slipper on it, her backbone, and a mysteriously shrunken skull. Mary's body, which weighed 170 pounds, had been reduced to less than 10 pounds. The only damage to the apartment was a small circular burned area. At the side was a plastic wall socket which had melted and caused her clock to stop at 4:20 a.m. These findings and the remains of Mary baffled the firemen, police and pathologists who examined them. Mary's apartment showed all the signs of heat damage. Walls were covered with a greasy soot, a mirror had cracked and plastic switches and 2 candles had melted. Experts said that a temperature of 2,500 degrees is necessary for such an extreme cremation. A cigarette could never have produced such a high temperature if it had ignited the chair or clothing. An FBI pathologist carried out tests for gasoline but nothing was found. Even a lightning storm had been considered, but no such storm had occurred in St. Petersburg on the night of her death. On the 7th of July 1951, St. Petersburg Police Chief J.R. Reichert sent a box of evidence from the scene to FBI Director John Edgar Hoover. He included glass fragments found in the ashes, 6 small objects thought to be teeth, a section of the carpet and the surviving shoe. Reichert sent with the evidence a note which read, "We request any information or theories that could explain how a human body could be so destroyed, and the fire confined to such a small area and so little damage done to the structure of the building." The FBI eventually declared that Reeser had been incinerated by the wick effect. As she was a known user of sleeping pills, they hypothesized that she'd fallen unconscious while smoking and set fire to her nightclothes. The FBI wrote in its report, once the body starts to burn, There is enough fat and other inflammable substances to permit varying amounts of destruction to take place. Sometimes this combustion of burning will proceed to a degree which results in almost complete combustion of the body. However, the local police never bought the wick effect story, and to many her death remains a mystery. So that was 5 mysterious cases of spontaneous human combustion. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more countdown videos.
Have you ever contemplated just how weird the world we live in is? If not, maybe after tonight's episode, you will. I have for you 3 unbelievable tales of murder, oddities, and the stranger side of human decency. From a man who survived the mob, a woman who fell victim to the oddest of crimes, and a story about spontaneous human combustion. Through them all, it's up to you to decide what is fact or fiction.
The line that divides the factual from the unreal has long since blurred. The tales we once thought fantastical, now implanted as truth. To decipher verity from the imagined, you must break from the ordinary and consider a universe where the outlandish prevails. Can you expand your mind to see beyond our perceived reality? Can you decide what's fact or fiction?
The good old days of Sin City weren't monitored by corporations and effective federal regulations. Overseeing the tables, the slots, and the cash flow were the families of Vegas. And while some would attest to how smooth things ran, others, like Todd Reston, would point to their unorthodox methods. They advised him not to come back, and Todd had been told plenty of stories about how they handled problems in their casinos. But his need to win far outweighed the cautionary tales he heard. As the hulking man laid another closed fist against his cheek, he had wished he had heeded the warnings. Todd's Vegas experience wasn't exactly what he was promised by his friends from in town. After losing everything at blackjack, a misfortune he blamed on the quick and dishonest hands of the dealer, Todd lost his cool at the table and was promptly escorted out with the agreement that his presence wouldn't be welcomed again. But Todd feared no man, and was confident all of those horror stories were old wives' tales intended to scare off the weaker gamblers. So he returned to reclaim what was his. His account of the following hours, after being forcefully grabbed from the table, are hazy at best. The first half of the beating still resonated throughout his body, even months later, but beyond that, the first thing he remembered was being picked up by travelers coming in from California. When he was conscious, they told him he had been literally crawling along Interstate 15, his body bloodied and coated with a thin layer of sand. The more Todd talked about what happened, the more his memory flashed fragments of those horrifying hours. That last strike from the burly fellow must have knocked him out cold. His memory had sparked images of darkness within a hint of light and the hum of a car engine. Muffled voices spoke inaudibly before he faded again. Then a heaviness. The first pile of something weighed down on his chest, snapping him back to reality. Shadows were poised over him, framed by the moonlight and hoofing mounds of dirt onto his body. Again he faded, but only until the rumbling of an engine kicked to life and faded away. They hadn't buried him deep enough, so when his mind could fully focus on the situation at hand, he mustered what strength he had and dug himself out. Through pain and looming death, Todd dragged himself across the desert. Though thirst nearly took him, he found himself crawling along the interstate a decent length of time later. Todd was alive for long enough to relay what he remembered, painting local police with a crude image of his attacker. Within a day of snitching, he was found dead in a motel room with a single gunshot wound to his head.
It's common knowledge that the mob ran Vegas with an iron fist. But was it that tough? You may have to dig into the history of the city to find out. But even if they were this deadly, could Todd have survived the dryness of the desert and being buried alive after being nearly beaten to death? We'll have an answer for you in a moment. But first, we have another incredible story. Rhonda Benson had tried to enjoy her time in Maryland, but being a business trip, it wasn't easy to relax. So she was looking forward to her return home. Little did she know, there would be a strange surprise waiting for her when she opened the front door.
What should have been a 1-hour flight from Washington, D.C. was stretched to just over 3 thanks to a layover in Philly. All Rhonda wanted to do was get home, but as she expected in the dead of winter, her Philadelphia flight was delayed. After a week of nonsensical team-building meetings, all she wanted was to return to her comfortable apartment. She hated how sterile hotels felt and couldn't wait to feel the familiarity of her own abode once again. She didn't travel often, not for any particular reason beyond the fact that she didn't like to. Her place was cozy. It had her stuff. It was her sanctuary from the world outside. Sure, she was a little bit of an introvert, but she mostly just liked that it was hers. During the taxi ride home, she did all she could to avoid conversation. Inevitably, everything she tried failed. At the end of the awkward ride, where she was forced to answer a multitude of questions about her job and reasons for traveling, she couldn't run to her door fast enough. When she opened the door, however, she wasn't met with that familiarity she longed for. She stood dumbfounded at the entrance to her apartment, wondering briefly if somehow she entered the wrong one. Nothing was as she left it. Much like the hotels she had just left, everything was so sterile and organized and clean. She struggled to remember if she had gone on a cleaning spree in the days leading up to her trip, but she recalled no mad session. That's when the realization hit her. Someone had been in her apartment. Without hesitating another moment, she slammed the door in front of her and dialed the Cleveland Police Department. The dispatch was just as confused as she was, especially when she took note that some of her more expensive items, her television and her Xbox, were still in the apartment. When police arrived and cleared the small 750-square-foot space as being empty and safe, she took account of everything that should have gone missing. To her surprise and delight, it was all still there. It's a story Rhonda tells regularly when she has the opportunity. The time someone broke into her apartment to clean it for her, leaving behind every valuable and stash of money she had. Though the unexpected cleaning was a strange surprise, it wasn't one she wanted to come home to again. In the days that followed, she installed an alarm on her door to deter any unwanted guests.
Is cleaning someone's apartment a crime? Surely not. But breaking in certainly is. So why would someone go through all the trouble to sneak into the apartment illegally just to clean it? You know, the human mind is a strange thing, but is it that strange? We'll revisit Rhonda's predicament in a moment, but before we do, vote now using the on-screen poll and in the comments section, and prepare to meet Count Sebastian Gelon of Barcelona. He was loved by his people, adored by those that served him. But that didn't stop the worst from happening to him. Join Sebastian on his last day on Earth and see if you can decipher what happened to him.
It was a death that shocked many, not just because Sebastian was beloved by those that knew him, but because of how the late Count had been found. Just hours before his death, Sebastian enjoyed the company of his family, who were quick to note something strange about the 62-year-old man. Some felt he wasn't quite himself, as if an ailment had slowed him down and distracted him. Still, as he was known to do, he entertained as best he could, telling his stories, recounting his time as Count in Barcelona. Just before retiring, Sebastian spoke with his servant. Many thought it was strange, as he was close to those that served him, but it wasn't like the Count to forego the company of others if they had company to offer. The young man recalled his exchange with Sebastian as being a pleasant interaction with pleasant conversation. When morning came, and the Count hadn't been seen past his usual hour, his servant entered his room to stir him awake. It wasn't like Sebastian to sleep in, but he had seemed overly tired the night before. The dark room gave no indication anything was wrong, but when the servant opened the window to let the sun in, his eyes fell upon a horrific sight. Sebastian was not in his bed, but instead on the floor, and not as a whole person. All that was left were 3 fingers, charred, half of each leg, and what looked like a part of his skull, fragmented and missing a large piece in the back, tucked between his severed limbs. In the middle of it all, a circle of ash, and what the servant thought to be the missing pieces of the Count. As the room itself was later dissected to determine what had happened to the Count, everyone was left in confusion. No one theory proved flawless. The room was covered in a moist soot, and an oil lamp lay on the floor, covered in ashes. Yet the lamp itself was empty, and the bed the Count slept in was unburned. The soot had found its way out of the Count's room into the nearby kitchen. The placement of Sebastian's skull between his legs confused investigators the most. Only one theory, posed 9 years later, accounted for the skull. It claimed that Sebastian's body was so quickly engulfed in flames and eviscerated that his head simply dropped to the floor when his body turned to ash. To this day, the case of Count Sebastian Jalón of Barcelona remains unsolved, lest we chalk it up to a supernatural act of spontaneous human combustion.
Spontaneous human combustion is no new concept, but is it something that actually happens? Or is there a more logical explanation? One, say, that suggests the tale of Sebastian not even being true. We've reached the reveal portion of today's episode, but before we divulge, don't forget to vote with your thoughts.
Are you ready to find out if you can decipher between fact or fiction? Let's look back at tonight's 3 stories and find out which were born from reality and which were fabrications of the imagination.
Let's start with Todd Reston, the man whose luck did not follow him to Las Vegas. We asked if you thought the mob truly ran the town with an iron fist, and whether a man like Todd could fall victim to their wrath. While stories of bodies being buried in the desert by the mob that once ran the city are very commonplace, our story wasn't tied to any specific legend, and there was no Todd Reston that survived such an ordeal. With that mystery solved, we move on to Rhonda Benson and her unexpected break-in. Do you believe someone would risk creating a criminal record just to tidy up someone else's home? If you don't, you probably should. This scenario actually happened to a Virginia man in 2017. He returned home from a trip to find his apartment had been cleaned and all his valuables left in place. Finally, we have the tragic death of Count Sebastian Jalón of Barcelona. We've all heard stories of spontaneous human combustion, but they're often followed by very plausible causes. Not in Sebastian's case, however. The theories posed were marred by holes, so this clearly is a false account of a person being reduced to ashes, right? Wrong. This horrific tale is that of Countess Cornelia de Bondi of Cesena, Italy, who in April of 1731 was found in the same manner as our dear Sebastian. No cause was ever found, though some believe the Countess's habit of bathing in camphorated spirit of wine may have played a part.
How well did you do in tonight's video? Did you look past the deception of our world and define the off-blurred line that struggles to separate lies from the truth? Let us know in the comment section below. And should you find the urge to test your perceptions again, be sure to subscribe and join us next time when we ask you to decide what's fact or fiction.
How you doing? I'm Callan and this is Slapped Ham. The following are the most terrifying cases of spontaneous human combustion ever recorded. But as always, before we get into these chilling stories, remember to hit that subscribe button for more awesome, creepy content just like this.
The death of 61-year-old Jeannie Saffin in 1982 is one of the most frequently discussed cases of supposed spontaneous human combustion in history. Unlike most of the victims of these mysterious events, Jeannie was not alone when her body burst into flames. Jeannie was born with significant disabilities, so she spent her entire life living in her parents' home. On September 15, 1982, she was in the kitchen of her parents' home with her father and brother-in-law. The two men weren't paying much attention to Jeannie until they saw a bright light out the corner of their eyes. They turned to Jeannie and saw that she was inexplicably on fire. They quickly began dousing Jeannie with water to put out the flames and called for an ambulance. She was treated for severe burns for a total of 8 days until she died from her injuries. The cause of death was listed as bronchopneumonia due to burns. An inquest was held into the circumstances surrounding Jeannie's death. At the inquest, Jeannie's family asserted that they believed it to be a case of spontaneous human combustion. According to Jeannie's father, he had witnessed flames shooting out of her mouth that made a terrifying roaring noise. He said that the image brought to mind a dragon breathing fire. Jeannie's family also claimed that the clothing Jeannie had been wearing was untouched by the fire. However, later research proved that this was untrue. The coroner at the inquest rebuffed the family's claims, insisting that humans can't spontaneously catch fire. Researchers later put forth the theory that the fire had been caused by the pilot light from the family's kitchen stove. Anecdotal evidence suggests that there were windows open in the kitchen that could have caused a cross breeze that could have blown the flame towards Jeannie and set her alight. Many are skeptical of the more mundane explanations for the fire that tragically ended Jeannie's life. Those who believe she combusted point to her father's testimony of flames coming from her mouth, as evidence that the source of the fire was Jeannie's body itself. Not all victims of spontaneous human combustion have family members to bear witness to their passings. In the case of Robert Francis Bailey, he was alone in an abandoned building when his body caught fire. Robert was known as an alcoholic. It's believed he was seeking shelter from the cold inside the building where he died on September 13, 1967. A person walking by called the fire department when they saw a bright light coming from inside the building. Within 5 minutes, a fire crew was on the scene. They found Robert on the floor, curled up as if he had pain in his stomach. The fireman reported that he had a slit in his stomach measuring about 4 inches, from which the flames seemed to be coming. They later described the flames as blue and looking like the flames from a blowtorch. Robert was still alive when the crew arrived. They reported that he was writhing in pain and appeared to be biting into a stair post. The crew later had to pry his jaw open around the post to remove his body from the scene, after emptying several fire extinguishers to put out the flames. There were other odd aspects to the case. Nothing else in the room other than Robert's body was on fire. After putting it out, the fire crew found little fire damage in the room or on Robert's clothing. Only the part of his shirt covering his stomach and a bit of the floor below his body were charred. They noted that there were several highly flammable substances in the room, but none of them had caught fire. A later inquest hypothesized that the fire had been caused by Robert dropping a cigarette onto his shirt. However, the lack of surrounding damage and the speed at which the flames seem to have grown make the theory unlikely. Additionally, skeptics note that a fire caused by a dropped cigarette wouldn't be bright enough to attract attention from outside. On July 2, 1951, 67-year-old Mary Reeser became an alleged victim of spontaneous human combustion. Like many of the victims of this terrifying phenomenon, Mary was alone at the time that her body apparently burst into flames. Mary lived alone in an apartment. On the day that Mary died, her landlady knocked on Mary's door to deliver a telegram that had arrived for her. When no one answered, she tried the doorknob. The knob seemed strangely hot to her, so she called the police. The police arrived and discovered that whatever fire had occurred in the apartment was already out. They found Mary's remains on a chair. Her body had mostly been reduced to ash. All that remained was her slippered foot, her spine, and her skull. The skull was one of the most unusual aspects of the case. According to investigators, it had shrunk to the size of a teacup. They confirmed that the skull had shrunken too much for the burning of her facial features to be the cause. Investigators also noted that there was very little damage to the room. A few plastic objects had melted just enough to morph their shapes, but nothing else appeared to be damaged. They didn't even find much smoke damage in the room. This is a perplexing detail as it requires temperatures of at least 1600 degrees Fahrenheit or 870 degrees Celsius to reduce a body to ash. At an inquest, an FBI investigator speculated that because Mary was known to use sleeping pills, it was plausible she had fallen asleep while smoking. However, other investigators disputed this claim, asserting that it would be impossible for a fire caused by a cigarette to reach temperatures high enough to fully cremate a human body. On March 26, 1986, Kendall Mott, the son of retired fireman George Mott, began to worry that his father hadn't been answering his repeated phone calls. According to testimony from his family and friends, George was depressed and suffered from lung problems that required him to use an oxygen tank in order to breathe. This kept him at home most of the time. When Kendall arrived at his father's home, he noticed that all of the house's windows appeared brown. On the inside of the house, the air appeared smoky and smelled like something had been burnt. George had formerly been a smoker but quit because of his lung problems, so the smell was certainly unexpected. Then Kendall found his father, or what remained of him. All that was left was a pile of ashes and a few pieces of bone. Authorities noted that the damage was similar to what would happen to a body had it been professionally cremated. More perplexing were the inconsistencies in the room. A nearby television had melted, but the bedding on which George's body had been incinerated was largely untouched. There was also a book of matches on the bedside table that hadn't ignited. Investigators also noted that George's oxygen tank was still running and hadn't been damaged, nor had the face mask. How had George's entire body been turned to ash, but the mask that he must have been wearing in order to breathe was untouched? The official theory was that George had decided to light a cigarette to help cope with his depression and removed his mask in the process. However, this doesn't explain how the fire had been hot enough to cremate George's body, yet hadn't damaged his bedding. Many believe he was killed as a result of spontaneous human combustion. The case of George Mott will remain in a niche group of alleged supernatural deaths that authorities may never be able to explain. Before we get to that number one spot and take a look at a truly curious case of alleged spontaneous human combustion, remember to hit that subscribe button and turn on channel notifications. That way you'll be completely up to date with all our latest content. Dr. John Bentley was a 92-year-old scientist when he became an alleged victim of spontaneous human combustion. On the morning of December 5th, 1966, a meter reader entered Dr. Bentley's home, having standing permission to enter unannounced due to the scientist's advanced age. He went into the basement to check the meters, where he noted a blue smoke that he described as sweet smelling. He then saw a large pile of ashes on the floor. The floor beneath had no evidence of burns, but there was a large square hole in the ceiling above. He went upstairs to investigate. Upstairs, after passing through a smoky bedroom, the man found the remains of Dr. Bentley in the bathroom. All that he found was a pile of ashes and the lower half of the scientist's right leg, the foot still clad in a slipper. He quickly called for help, panicked at the sight, but clearly Dr. Bentley was beyond saving. There were numerous theories about the death. Some speculated that Dr. Bentley had set himself alight with his pipe. However, the pipe was found unlit on the bedside table. Others noted that the man's clothing were found smouldering in the bathtub, leading him to believe that his clothes had caught fire from the matches in the pocket. They asserted that Dr. Bentley had likely awoken to find his clothes on fire, run to the bathroom and remove the robe, but died before being able to put out the fire. However, a fire hot enough to fully cremate the scientist's body was unlikely to have been started by a random spark to an unlit match.
If you want more unsolved paranormal cases just like these ones, then check out that video on the top there, or there's an entire playlist there for you to binge on. In the comments section below, let us know whether you believe in spontaneous human combustion or not. And that's it for me. I'll see you all next time. Pew!
Spontaneous human combustion. This is something of a cult favorite topic. And there's a story that was sent to me by Matt about a man's body that was found burned inside a home. The death is unexplained. And fire crews went in and they went to a house fire. They saw smoke coming out of the house. They found a man's body in the middle of the kitchen floor burned. No fire damage anywhere else. Cause of the burning unknown. Okay? And right away, when the story like this comes out, people start saying it's that spontaneous human combustion that we have so many rumors about, and people say it could be a supernatural thing. So I did a little research. There's about 200 cited cases worldwide over the last 300 years of this spontaneous combustion. Of course, whenever I see something like this, I don't jump to the paranormal explanation. Some other people may. But what are the natural explanations? And they seem to be a couple of different things. One, production of an abnormally concentrated gas or raised blood alcohol level could cause spontaneous ignition, okay? Health and lifestyle factors like smoking or not having enough water in your body, things like that can be factors. And something involving external ignition sources, like you're drunk and you drop a cigarette, that type of thing. Now, the most common explanations are, okay, if we look at most cases of suspected spontaneous human combustion, they involve low mobility people, either due to advanced age or obesity, and poor health, meaning that if even the smallest fire starts, they're often unable to move. And if they die in their sleep, a fire may then start subsequently, and then they may burn. Now, how they initially get lit on fire while they're sleeping, not as many explanations there. Cigarettes are often cited as the source here, which is dropped cigarette, person fell asleep with a cigarette or just can't move, they burn, and because of the combination of water levels and whatever in their body, it seems to kind of extinguish itself without spreading anywhere. These are the explanations I've come up with, Lewis.
All right. But there is no consensus.
Well, I don't know. Would you say there's a consensus on this, Natan?
I think we should get the Mythbusters guys to come in and do a little experiment on Lewis. We can use him as a little guinea pig and test out the hypotheses.
I don't think I'm very flammable.
Why is that?
He's explosive, though.
I don't know. I usually have a very low BAC.
Okay.
And not very gaseous.
We've got to take a break. Let's, on that note.
No, I'm kidding, obviously.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, but
no,
so you are the thought of being
brilliant,
set on fire is not ideal.
Okay, we'll discuss off air whether we set Lewis on fire or not. That's probably a conversation for behind closed doors. We'll take a break. I want to talk about aircraft carrier launched drones next and a lot more stuff. Stay with us. Back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
George Mott had been a fireman in upstate New York for 30 years and escaped injury from deadly flames hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. Tragically, on March 25, 1986, in Crown Point, New York, he met with a fire he could not control. Mott had recently retired and had been hospitalized for lung problems. He had just returned home. Since his illness, his nightly routine had changed. He kept track of new medications and learned to use an oxygen enrichment machine.
He got that after he got out of the hospital. They gave it to him so that at night when he was laying down, and it would make it easier for him to breathe. The air would go in through his nose so he could breathe clean air during the night.
What happened the night of March 25, 1986, has been cause for much speculation. George's son, Kendall Mott, had checked in on his father every night since his father's return from the hospital. Because he had to work late on March 25th, Kendall wasn't able to make his regular visit. The next evening, he went to his father's house directly after work.
I reached for the door handle, and the door handle was warm. So, I automatically knew something was wrong. And when I opened the door, it was warm inside the house, and there was a burnt smell, like a metallic smell. I guess my immediate reaction was, oh God, because you walk in and the whole house was black because the windows had all been brown from the heat. And so it was really dark inside the house. It was like walking in a dungeon. So I went back to the back bedroom, went through the house. I called his name a couple times. And from what I could see, I didn't have a flashlight or anything, but it was just getting dark. What I could see, I could tell that, he was dead. You could see where the burn marks were on the bed.
When the fire department arrived, they found a scene unlike any other they had ever confronted. Bob Purdy was among the firefighters that day.
I've seen a lot of fires. I've seen quite a few fatalities where people were burned, but I've never seen anything like this. Never.
These photos taken in the Mott bedroom that night reveal what firefighters witnessed.
The man was laying in bed and he disintegrated. You can see the V in the bed where he rendered down body fats, etc., bed clothing, whatever, and right down through the floor. And the house didn't catch on fire. And there's the matches, sitting right on that aerator, and just 6 inches above them you see the brown spot. But the matches never ignited.
As firefighters moved through the house, they were confronted by incredible scenes at every turn. A greasy coating covered every horizontal surface. The water had evaporated from the toilet, and the tub was ringed with soot as if someone had taken a bath in black paint. The house itself was unburned, but objects within had been severely damaged. When investigators opened the refrigerator, they found a surreal scene. Not only the butter, but the plastic butter dish itself had melted. There was an unopened package of hot dogs that appeared to have been boiled in the wrapping.
We looked for accelerants, we looked at gas, we looked at electric, we looked at fuel. There's nothing. We even looked for maybe a lightning strike or something, and nothing. There was nothing there.
When investigators approach a fire scene, they look for patterns to help them determine the origins of the fire. These fire investigator training photos show that fires burn in upward cones, leaving telltale V patterns scorched on nearby walls. In the Mott living room, several of the interior walls were covered with cedar shingles. The New York State Police pointed to a V pattern on the wall surrounding an electrical outlet. They theorized that an electrical arc leapt from the outlet and started George Mott on fire. Mott then stumbled to his bed and died engulfed in flame.
We had several meetings, and the state police stayed with their story. And I couldn't buy that. My investigators couldn't buy that. Where they showed the V-shaped pattern was underneath a window where the curtains had caught fire and dropped to the floor and then burnt back up again. That's what that V pattern was from. It wasn't from electrical.
To prove their point, Purdy's men took apart the wall. Fire damage had come from the room's interior, not from within the outlet.
We went through them receptacles. There was no shorts in those receptacles. We took them apart. There was no short. I mean, we looked at all aspects. We looked at homicide. We looked at suicide. We looked at all the aspects of how this could happen, and nothing added up.
The only thing really left of George Mott identifiable as a human being were A, his lower right leg burned from the kneecap, his skull that people who knew him told us had mysteriously shrunken. The rest of George Mott was really powder, calcined dust, and you do not get that even under normal cremation circumstances.
Larry Arnold contends that it was a misfunction of George Mott's body chemistry which caused the fire.
The body temperature is regulated by a gland called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus not only regulates the body's furnace, so to speak, but it's also the seat of emotions, which in terms of spontaneous human combustion is very interesting. Many of the victims are depressed or morose, they're lacking the desire to live, or they're hot under the collar, so to speak.
Human beings' body temperature produce enough heat to have caused this bizarre death? There are cases of hypothermia caused by dysfunction of the hypothalamus.
But there are no cases where the temperature is raised, beyond maybe 106 at the outside. And again, the temperature would have to be raised to over 200 degrees Fahrenheit before, say, body fat, for example, would ignite. So there is nothing even close to that reported in the medical literature.
Another puzzle still remains. What could have caused the strange fire selectivity seen on the objects in the Mott home? Science offers one explanation. Heat rises in a column. When it hits the ceiling, it spreads out, first in a thin layer, and then that layer thickens. Consequently, objects on the floor near a fire do not necessarily burn, while an object near the ceiling, 2 or 3 rooms away, will be damaged. The heat that night in the Mott home was intense. Mattress materials would become a flammable liquid and drip under the bed, eventually forming a pool. Mott's wooden flooring was easily ignited.
One of the ways we identify flammable or ignitable liquid fires is that they do tend to burn downward, that the liquid falls to the floor, often burns through it, that there are sharp lines of demarcation or sharp edges between what's burned and what's unburned.
Once the fire burned through the floor, it gained access to the oxygen in the crawl space below. The resulting draft would have intensified the fire like a bellows. We know how the fire progressed, but if it wasn't spontaneous human combustion, what started it in the first place?
We know Mott used to smoke, we know he was depressed, and we know 2 other facts that strike me as being difficult to explain unless we adopt the hypothesis that he might have resumed smoking, and that is that he had the oxygen enricher unit going full blast, but he was not wearing the mask. And secondly, why have standing of all places on your oxygen enricher unit a canister of matches?
His lungs were getting pretty bad at that time, so he put up a no smoking sign. And he'd even make me go out on the porch and smoke when I wanted to have a cigarette, because he wouldn't let anybody smoke inside his house.
George took care of his health. He was a fireman. He knew the effects of fire. He knew the dangers of fire. Whatever struck down George Mott, he was ill prepared to deal with that night, and it cannot be explained away as a dropped cigarette.
That George Mott died in a fiery inferno is known. The actual ignition point of that fire will continue to be unexplained. But for believers in spontaneous human combustion, the source of the fire will always be George Mott himself. Those who are skeptical about spontaneous human combustion say the victim is always alone. There is never any eyewitness testimony. Don Carroll, painter-decorator from London, wishes that were true. Carroll witnessed the horrifying death of his sister-in-law, Jean Saffin. It happened on September 10th, 1982, at 82 Chalfont Road in Edmonton, a quiet London suburb. It was a warm evening. John Saffin and his daughter Jean were in the kitchen. Jean was 60 years old at the time. Don Carroll, her brother-in-law, remembers her fondly.
She was mentally retarded from birth, but she was a lovely kid. She used to help her mother. She was always with her mother.
Since her mother's death, Jean was taken care of solely by her father, John Saffin. She would sit in her favorite chair most of the day. She couldn't read, but she liked to look through the newspapers. As Mr. Saffin sat relaxing after dinner, he noticed when he turned to see what it was, he discovered that Jean was spewing fire from her mouth. Mr. Saffin leapt to his feet and tried to put out the fire. Don Carroll, who was visiting at the time, heard the commotion and rushed to the kitchen.
I pulled myself together and I rushed there and I got bowls of water. And I literally had to duck underneath to stop getting burnt by the flames that were coming out of her midriff and her mouth. Put it this way, if you was a child, you see fairy tale stories of a dragon breathing fire, and you see it on films when you was a kid, but it's just what I walked into. The flames were coming out of Jeannie's mouth, a good 2 feet, maybe more, and it was a roaring sound. We put the flames out, and she was just standing there, and she didn't cry, pain or anything, she didn't murmur.
Don Carroll phoned for an ambulance. Jean was taken to Mount Vernon Hospital's burn unit, where she went into a coma. The hospital staff told the family Jean's chances of survival were slim.
It may sound cruel, but to see her suffer, I think, would it have been better if she'd have gone straight away?
6 days later, after Jean Saffin died, the London police sent Constable Lee Marsden to investigate.
Upon arriving there, I remember seeing members of the family who were obviously upset and distressed, as they would be. Appeared to be very genuine people.
Constable Marsden interviewed John Saffin and Don Carroll about the incident. Based on their comments, he prepared a formal report which they confirmed and signed.
It would be normal practice when looking at the scene of this sort of incident to examine to see whether there were any cigarettes lying around, any matches, ashtrays, to ask whether the person in fact herself smoked.
Jean Saffin never smoked, and Don Carroll thought she wouldn't even know how to strike a match. John Saffin told Constable Marsden that he had a pipe with a fresh pack of tobacco in it when the incident started.
He never used to smoke in the kitchen when Jeannie was in there. When Mr. Saffin smoked his pipe, he used to go into the front room.
With that knowledge, Constable Marsden tried to discover another source of ignition which may have started the fatal fire.
No plug sockets, electrical sockets, no gas points within reach of that chair. The floor was a hard floor. There was a gas cooker across the kitchen. You couldn't reach it by stretching or reaching your foot across. As far as I was concerned, I couldn't explain how this lady had gone up in flames.
Did Jean Saffin indeed breathe fire like a dragon? Is this a verifiable case of spontaneous human combustion?
Suppose that a few moments before these tragic events, the father, with his pipe going away, burning well, went over and knocked knocked out the hot ashes on the windowsill. And now the breeze blows one of those hot